It is pretty meaningful for me to be back here. This is a place where I grew up, where what used to be CFAD seminars beginning in 2008 were a meaningful, inspirational time for me to learn about all kinds of approaches to these larger issues we're looking at. So very meaningful. And specifically, this is part of my dissertation, which AWARE, the Advancing Women in Agricultural Research and Extension, supported. And so in fulfillment and in thanks for that, I'm very happy to come back and share some of the results. And like she said, this is a dissertation which has been published, but there's also parts of it, such as this very same title, What Women Know That Men Do Not About Chestnut Trees in Turkey, a Method of Hearing Muted Knowledge, is published in the Journal of Ethnobiology, so you can go to that for a lot of details and background stuff. And I will stick pretty closely to that content, but what I can do in a group like this, which is very exciting for me, is give a peek under the hood as to the trial and error and the challenges we faced in achieving one of our main goals, which was engaging women in what they knew about the chestnut tree in Turkey. In Turkey, the chestnut tree is a native species. It's also enduring a number of different pathogen invasions, some dating back over 100 years, but leading up to new invasions that are more recent. So it's a kind of a timely situation, and what I'd hope you get from this presentation is why it might be important and why it is a kind of a necessity to engage women and what they know about species that are under threat, and also how it's very much doable and possible with a little bit of what's known as extra effort. So to begin, our first efforts to really speak with women and learn what they knew about the chestnut tree in Turkey were a bit frightening for the women. 3 men in an SUV in a rural landscape, jumping out and attempting to find a woman, and literally this was the strategy I think mistakenly went with it at a few points, and it didn't work. And other things didn't work. Here you see I brought my darling son up to the rural landscapes where people were involved in harvesting, thinking that this lovely, beautiful boy would help me sit down and speak with women and they'd be less afraid with me. And no, instead they said, you're not taking good enough care of this boy. Here's his coat. He's got some extra food. Now you get out there and carry chestnuts, which I was happy to do. So, but they're pretty spiny, so it was quite a sentence. But I've done a lot of it, gotten used to it. So with that being said, we'll go into some of the subject material. It's been a long road, and I couldn't have done it without 2 very important partners that you see here, Nesibe Kose from Istanbul University and Elif Aksoy from the Hacettepe University Department of Anthropology, along with Nesibe's husband, Coşkun, and our research partner, Taner Erdoğan, both from the Istanbul University Department of Forestry. We're with here the field staff with the National Directorate of Forestry of Çanakkale, area in western Turkey. This office and this bureaucratic system was incredibly valuable in getting us out into the landscapes, and they are actually a very successful government office for managing forests, and they do a lot of work with chestnut. My committee was invaluable, and all of the supporters, including IPCal's AWARE. So roadmap for today, I'm going to go into a little bit background about my own discipline, which is known as ethnobiology. I'm going to explain the focus of ethnobiology on knowledge and how gender has become a challenging frontier in the engagement of local and traditional ecological knowledge. I'll lead up to what I consider my purpose statement for the study that I'm showing you now. I'll tell you a little bit about the context I did this work, the results, and some discussion and conclusions. So to get us all situated, I think what I'd like to do is define what ethnobiology is and explain why ethnobiology considers biocultural associations very important conservation targets or conservation objects. So I'll explain what all that means nice and slowly. Ethnobiology is basically the discipline of what you might call the interdisciplinary study of biocultural associations, or human people's relations with landscapes or with the more than human living world around them. And specifically, today, in today's day and age, we're in the scientific community and slowly radiating outward, we may be able to easily and accurately describe our planetary era as that of the Anthropocene, meaning humans are such a defining influence on the planet that the planet era should be named after human influence. And ultimately, what this means in terms of biological loss is that a signature issue of the Anthropocene, or this new era, is declining and accelerating decline of biological diversity and biological complexity. And other measures that you might take up, like decline of species number and decline of habitats. However, in the Anthropocene, if one acknowledges that one primary or a very significant influence on the declining biodiversity, one has to also acknowledge that what is buoying and mitigating biological loss is also human influence as well. A lot of that is unconscious, and you can think in that terms the wild success of species like kudzu or the Norwegian wharf rat. But fortunately, a huge portion of this work is now becoming conscious in the form of what we call environmental preservation or biological conservation. However, when you choose your biological objects for conservation, you come into the conundrum of biological conservation or environmental conservation writ large. Hargrove is an environmental ethicist who articulates it like this. He says, the mere existence is a necessary but not a sufficient reason for preserving a natural object or natural system. To provide a basis for discriminating between and ranking candidates for preservationist action, we need to go beyond mere existence to the values associated with it. Ultimately, we can't bring everything with us into the future from our biosphere, and what is most valuable to us is necessarily what we should focus on. Ethnobiologists have a very specific view on this. One, biocultural associations, species that already have established distinct, tremendous value with peoples, established cultural groups, or however you want to define it, have the incredible advantage of being inherently valuable and inherently motivating to enlist people in conservation efforts, much like the chestnut tree in Turkey. So, ethnobiology has a really good track record of working at this angle. For one, there's almost nearly 2 centuries of documentation of peoples from around the world and their most valued species, usually in terms of utilization. The earliest explorers were definitely circulating in colonial times looking for useful plants for industry and useful plants for pharmaceuticals. However, they have created a very important record, which is almost 200 years old at this point, which ethnobiologists really started to look at in 1948 and to really study in terms of what are the most effective principles that keep people's knowledge and actions conserving the environment. So the effective theory is really focused on how people categorize their environments in terms of understanding the categories and the taxonomy of their environments and how that is a very important factor in people's maintaining their local ecological diversity, and also how people signify or have tremendous significance for different ecological processes and also ecological objects you might call, such as species or pollination relationships and whatnot. And finally, ethnobiology has done a great job, I think, bringing a lot of this important ethnobiological knowledge, this biocultural associations, to the attention of governance agencies. If you look at the United Nations Environmental Program and their Nagoya Protocol, you see that traditional ecological knowledge is mandated to be collected in the process of biological conservation efforts. And there's even very important mentions of traditional ecological knowledge in the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So the big challenge facing ethnobiology over time has been to understand how knowledge in a community about plants, about animals, about relationships between all of these, how it's not necessarily stored equally between individuals. So for instance, early efforts, and probably for decades, ethnobiologists assumed going into communities, doing interviews, all this biological knowledge would accumulate in the elderly. So if you interviewed enough older folks, you would have a really good insight into everything that a community knew. And actually, there's been some success with that. However, other social categories are often neglected in the process, and there's a history of that. And one of them would be gender. Sophisticated methods haven't been developed in which to really engage women in terms of what they know. And that's been a challenge for ethnobotany for a few decades. But those who've studied it have come upon a couple principles that you might help mitigate this problem. For one, we should be cognizant that women tend to know in traditional contexts, in traditional and indigenous livelihood contexts, a lot about different habitats than men know about. Primarily habitats closer to homesteads, home gardens, disturbed landscapes where medicinal plants often grow and small herbaceous species are well known to women but not so well known to men. And on the other hand, Men tend to know a lot more about landscapes beyond the home garden and out into the wilderness in terms of wildlife, but especially in terms of forest species. So the case species of chestnut is a very interesting case to look at women's knowledge of a tree species, which in the ethnobotanical literature is, shouldn't be as, let's say, voluminous as men's. However, there's always been a question of how these studies have been conducted. Two things that have really been pointed out are, one, looking at the typical interests of academics in the field when they're studying plant relationships. A very famous meta-study looked at all the traditional ecological and medicinal knowledge out of South America, authored by Cothriel. I'll show you in the works cited. She understood that men's, or a predominant interest in men's knowledge being shamanic and medicinal and cosmological spiritual exercises specifically to do with psychotropic drugs and psychotropic plants, vastly overwhelmed the very, very voluminous information that women held about more traditional nurturing roles such as household medicine, day-to-day digestion activities, day-to-day diet. And so in the South American literature on plant knowledge, there's a higher proportion of men's knowledge represented. Another issue has to do with the composition of the research team, which is in a number of different social contexts. Turkey would be a prime example, which I'll go into. The composition of the research team, let's say the gender makeup of the research team, can make or break the success of engaging women's knowledge. And so this really dovetails with a larger, let's say, challenge in social research, having to do with what's been known for decades as the gender knowledge gap. Seen here in agricultural science, in maternal knowledge, or let's say maternal studies, and internet use, Wikipedia, I've seen the gender knowledge gap kind of dispersed throughout the information landscape. And the problem is that in the main literature that studied it, political science, it's been entirely discredited. So what was initially understood as a very burning question, why do women know less about political knowledge than men, became quickly a question of what are we doing in our methods that is eliciting more information from men than from women. And one of the major discoveries was something very simple. On a meta-study that looked at a lot of different political surveys, if you just eliminated the women's answers, I don't know, you kind of leveled the scores of knowledge, meaning women were much less likely to say or guess than men. Women were much more likely to admit when they didn't know, basically. Finally, we kind of come around to a really important piece in Dolan, looking at political knowledge and asking a very potent question, do women just know different things about politics that aren't being asked about in survey instruments? And the answer was certainly yes. She came up with women had a tremendous amount of knowledge compared to men when you asked them about relations between government bodies, specifically processes which allowed the different bodies in government from the citizenry on up to the executive to really engage each other, whereas men were much better at identifying who's the prime minister, who's the agricultural minister, and bullet facts like that. So in terms of my own study, I wanted to engage and record traditional knowledge of the European chestnut across a representative geography in Turkey, and to do so in a way that it would allow later investigation of the differences between men's and women's reported knowledge. It would also allow investigation of the differences in results of a control and an experimental interview protocol. I'll explain a lot about what that means along the way, but ultimately, I attempted to do a classic ethnobotanical study that accounted for the differences in gendered knowledge in a very deliberate way. So a little bit about where I attempted to do this would be very useful. Turkey, this is what might be described as the suitable habitat for chestnut across Turkey. A few things to take note of would be just your general cultural knowledge about these different areas. So on the western frontier of Turkey, you've got nations like Greece and Bulgaria and the Aegean and Mediterranean Sea. And on the northern eastern area of Turkey, you've got the Caucasus, the high dramatic terrain of the high Caucasus, and the rather high precipitation zone of the Black Sea. And what is not necessarily clear from this map is that there's a wall of mountains which runs along this seacoast, which has rendered this terrain quite interesting in terms of microclimate dynamics. But ultimately, it's also become a kind of a culturally unique zone in Turkey. And specifically, the region of the Caucasus in northeastern Turkey hosts the highest genetic diversity for the species. This is where the species' primary refugia was at the last glaciation. So really, this is the center of genetic diversity for the species. And you can kind of see that genetic diversity kind of stretch out over in this direction. And at a certain point, you have a certain break. And this break represents both genetic diversity and horticultural approaches. So all along the northern coast of the Black Sea region, all the way past Istanbul, which is right here, and on into the Bulgarian border, chestnut trees are volunteer species, naturally aggressive in cleared spaces, but do well in all manner of elevations and spread on their own. And this is also true of the Marmara Sea. However, what begins here around this Marmara Sea and continues down to the western areas, which are much more Greek influenced, is the persistent horticultural maintenance of chestnut, meaning the tree is almost 100% grafted from this point down. Even though it could grow and survive in wild conditions in the Marmara Sea, it doesn't tend to. It tends to be located in horticultural areas, gardens and groves and orchards. What is more is that the three very, very effective and catastrophic diseases and pests have arrived in Turkey over the last century. One in 1906 was what's known as the ink disease, followed by the chestnut blight, which we know well here in North America, and much more recently is the gall wasp. And all of those, at this point, as of right now, are pretty much observed in all areas of Turkey where there are chestnut trees. There are a lot of dynamics there, but ultimately a lot of pest pressure everywhere. The Black Sea region kind of looks like this: high precipitation, high dramatic terrain with kind of isolated agroforest intensive village communities, a lot of tea production alongside timber and alongside chestnut, hazelnut, and whatnot. Whereas this looks very different than the southwest, which is much more of a Mediterranean climate where chestnut trees are irrigated in order to get them started as saplings and maintained very vigorously with prescribed burning and with routine pruning. But just very dry, very wet, very different climates. And what are the gender dynamics in rural Turkey? Well, much like in any country you'd imagine, what are gendered codes inside Turkish culture are much more, let's say, adhered to in rural space. So what those might mean is women tend to be found in the home. And if they're not in the home, they're in some other place where the household tends to maintain some kind of ownership, meaning their own private gardens. If they are in chestnut groves where there's kind of haphazard collecting, they're with family groups and attended by males. So they tend to maintain their own space. Men, on the other hand, are often out in public, often in tea gardens or in cafes, and have a much more liberated lifestyle in terms of where they go. They tend to often be the ones who can drive cars. Their public roles are quite different. For a research context, you might imagine that in a mixed gender scenario, women are, it's considered polite for them not to be so loud and not to be colorfully describing anything, and men are much more in the driver's seat in terms of who's talking, especially to an outsider. And what I'm learning more and more about is what it means to know something in terms of gender, in terms of Turkey. And I'll come back to that, but there's very specific roles about what is known and how individuals share what they know. And finally, agricultural labor is really, in rural Turkey, a premier factor of life for rural women. Their agricultural labor is necessary for the success of their private individual household. It's often necessary for their success of their own individual revenues, which they may want some spending money on their own. Those are all initiatives on their own right. And their labor is also accessible to their family and their kin, their brothers and their uncles and their wives' brothers and husbands, and in a radiating circle can always kind of call in female labor to do work in, let's say, chestnut groves or agricultural fields. So what we did was basically try to elicit any and all information we could on these specific subjects. So this methodology would be described as our core methodology. We implemented this with all our research groups. And we, in total, interviewed 142 groups, and I'll get into their distribution. But ultimately, what did you use the chestnut tree for, and which part? What were the traits or the qualities of that part that were very important for each use? And what are the kinds or types of chestnut materials? For instance, chestnut wood, the flowers, integral to each use. So this is a pretty intense category, and I'm going to go into it in more detail, but ultimately, what kind of chestnuts are there? What kind of chestnut trees? What kind of chestnut flowers are there? We thought it would be a kind of maybe something we'd try out, experimental, and didn't know if we'd include it in the final results, but it became a very important category. And I'll get back to explaining what it means. You'll have some much more concrete examples. And finally, we attempt to elicit from all of our interviewees, what is the cultural value for the tree and its products, embodied in rituals, personal stories, legends, and other cultural topics. And ultimately, what we did was create 2 parallel protocols for doing research with all of our interviewees, which really tried to get at those information areas in very flexible ways. So I'll describe a little bit about that. Ultimately, what we would do in each village was start with a male household. So meaning, I mean a male representative of a household. In Turkey, it would be the only appropriate way for an outsider group like researchers to approach a village and the people in the social community of a village would be to, one, talk with the leader of that village, the elected representative of that village, known as the muhtar, and who would invariably be a male, and ask him about chestnut growing households. He would in turn introduce us to other household units, invariably the male representative of that household, and we would go from there. Now, in one set of areas, in far northern Black Sea area, where we first started this protocol, the scenes where we're jumping out of the SUV, the scenes where I'm bringing up my son, we're trying our best to come at the research environment and invite men and women to participate together. And what inevitably felt like a failure to engage women's knowledge, we decided would be best to serve us as a control group for what you might call conventional ethnobotanical approaches, meaning we would invite women to participate. In interview context, we would encourage women to share what they knew, but our research team was mixed gender, male and female, and often the study environment was mixed gender, so meaning there were males and females present. Now, in many cases, we would invite women, we would encourage the invitation of women, and women wouldn't come. But that would be pretty representative of how ethnobotanical surveys tend to work, so we kept it as a control group. In a different part of the country, when we kind of wised up and realized we needed to hire Elif Aksoy and say we need an anthropologist who knows how to work with women, and we need to create special interview environments for women, we would start with the male head of household and ask him, may we interview your female relatives? And he would almost invariably oblige. And then Elif Aksoy and Nesibe would go to either household or field or orchard where the women of the household could be found and interview them there privately with only women. Meanwhile, we'd be out with the men. And so that's what these interview environments look like, would be what I call men-only interview environments, women-only interview environments, and gender unaddressed. So you can kind of see how the spread works across Turkey. In these regions, which we chose to represent the full geography of the chestnut habitat and the full geography of the chestnut horticulture, we interviewed people all along the way. But as you see here, this unique Black Sea region was where we conducted only gender unaddressed protocols. And in the Marmara, which is also climatically, and also in this area of the Black Sea, climatically similar to the Black Sea, we did our men-only and women-only protocol. And down in the western, what's called the Aegean provinces, we did our men-only, women-only protocol. So the first thing you might look at is how would we distinguish our results by region so that we knew what we were learning about what women knew. So there's some statistical approaches that I think were successful. So a total of 142 interviews, which were group interviews, upwards of 3 to 5 people per interview. 48 were gender unaddressed, 48 were men only, and 46 that we included in this study were women only. So with all these specific categories of knowledge, we looked at the full data set, which I'm going to show you a little bit about that right now, and decided what are the important categories of this knowledge. So one would be, we asked about uses. We have a specific code for uses. These were quite easy. They were, for example, using the wood for windows, using the wood in a cultural way for grave boards, using the wood for bean stakes, using it as a mulch, the husks of the chestnut tree, using it as a feed, and so on. Also, of course, very important category, food. All different recipes, all different uses we recorded. We also came upon, just the basic, just focus here for a second on traits. Traits were the qualities of the plant part that were important for each use. And we found that there was a need to discern direct traits versus indirect traits. So the direct trait would say, oh yeah, it's a big chestnut. So that's a great quality for this particular recipe. But for women, let's say, using the chestnut husk for the mulch, this was a bad quality, really tough, sharp spines that don't deteriorate well. But that was very different than what people said about using chestnut in some process that would manifest later on. So honey would be a great example. Honey was a very common product that people associated with chestnut, chestnut honey, made from the inflorescence of the chestnut tree at the season of the chestnut inflorescence. That had very unique properties. People raved about them. That was what we considered an indirect property. And finally, something like how animals' meat tasted after eating chestnut leaves was an indirect property. What jumped out from our data set that we hadn't expected would be things such as unique reports. So we found in our cataloging of all these different responses that some individuals said something that no other individual said. And apart from a story, which is kind of necessarily something that only one individual knows, we recorded or gave some kind of point system for how many unique reports came out of a certain interview. And those were very interesting and honestly really, really priceless, so we didn't want to exclude them. So for instance, down to specific details, this specific variety does not split when it's roasted, which is a very good quality. Chestnut flower tea is good for hemorrhoids and any number of medicinal values, but this was the only one we heard about hemorrhoids. And such a thing is, if piled with husks, let's say you collect your whole harvest and pile it up with a husk, the nuts continue to mature in the husk provided you don't detach them from the husk. Only one person made that comment. So those were something we made sure and keep tabs of. What jumped out of a lot of our cultural reports was this kind of taxonomy. Legends would be, sometimes people would say something along the lines of, before the Common Era, people ate chestnut with honey. That would be prior to, let's say, the coming of, they used the Common Era, miletanunje, meaning they use Christ as a historical period, but that's because the Greeks brought it to them, so they just call it the era. Prior to the era, people used to eat chestnut with honey, some kind of important insight into past life. There were a lot of poems, sayings were very common, and unique language terms by region were also really important. And you kind of get the sense of what cultural reports would be. And finally, when I asked what kinds of chestnuts are there, what kind of chestnut trees are they, this really blew up into a number of different categories that I hadn't foreseen, and so made sure to record this as a separate category. For instance, when we really went into the question, we assumed they would say, there is a variety of chestnut known as black chestnut, there's a variety of chestnut known as white chestnut, and those are the horticultural varieties of chestnut. That's what we expected. But many people did, but other people said, well, there's chestnuts that fall early from the tree in association with the early western wind, and the other chestnuts fall later. So that was a category that was much more important to some interviewees, and they didn't say anything about horticultural varieties. Many people made mention of whether a variety was gone. That was a really important category. What kind of chestnut trees are there? Well, there's a number that are gone that we miss, and there's the ones that are here now that we don't like. That was pretty common. Big and small was a very important categorization, and especially in terms of women's labor, as we'll see. So that's kind of how these break down, and what my editor calls this is the good stuff. So I'll try to focus on that stuff a lot throughout the rest of my time here. But, is that right? 50 past, meaning? Sweet, great, great. All right, so back to this approach to what we did with this data and all these categories. We conducted a process called multiple correspondence analysis, meaning for each of those categories that I just showed you, we gave each interview a score based on how many contributions they made. So if they listed 1,000 traits, they would definitely get a 5. And if they listed 0 traits, they'd definitely get a 0. And that created what's called a kind of a categorical variable out of the score. It could have been A, B, C, D, E, for instance. But with this system of multiple correspondence analysis, you get to look at the relation of these data sets or these different data groups in Euclidean space. And you'll see how that's very useful in the results. And also, what we'll look at here, just so you know, is the differences between, let's say, knowledge based on region, those different regions that I looked at, some wondering if that affected the results that would come further, and you'll see how that panned out. Again, coming back to another way to determine the effect of gender but also accounting for the effect of the region where I collected data, I conducted two-way analysis of variance. And so for each interview, I created what might be a total knowledge score. So all the scores from this got tallied up and created a numeric score for each interview. So you may say that if everyone scored a 5, or if someone scored a 5 on all categories, they would have a really high volume of knowledge, what may be described as that kind of knowledge quantity. But I also looked at the knowledge diversity score, meaning in all those different categories, what was the richness and evenness per category for these different interviewees in their reporting. So I used a typical index known as the Simpsons diversity index to look at richness and evenness, and you'll see the results from that. And to look at all the differences, the main differences, use something called Tukey post hoc. So you can kind of look at the general gist of where this all laid out. In a similar sample size, men most certainly reported higher uses than women. And the similar in a gender unaddressed, each interview generated more uses than what was typically produced by women. However, uniqueness of knowledge was much higher in the women's category. Women reported 93, what we called unique reports, compared to 28 and 29 in the men and unaddressed cohort, respectively. Similarly, you can look at traits. The classic ethnobotanical investigation of traits may have turned up that this gender unaddressed would produce more than women and men, which was interesting. And cultural reports, women significantly higher. And typologies was fairly even, but women were higher. What I'd like you to start looking at now is the similarity of the men-only interview protocol, the results from that, and the results from the interviews where we didn't address gender whatsoever, invited women as they would come, but didn't specifically elicit their reporting any more than a conventional approach would. So that kind of bears out in this analysis as well. This is that multiple correspondence analysis where you look at these different interview groups. So what was the Aegean, that Mediterranean side, compared to the Black Sea side, compared to that Marmara Sea. In this graph, what you see is no strong relationship. These equidistance points are pretty much show that there's no specific thing differing between these groups. And similarly, their size may be described as somewhat different, but ultimately remember, and think something to keep in mind is that this is where I performed gender only, or gender unaddressed, and this is where I performed men only and women only, so these two. So you kind of got more, bigger circles of information, bigger, more expansive reporting and knowledge expressed. But really where it begins to show is by comparing the different protocol. So the women only is a much larger circle, meaning more expansive, less bounded, and more diverse information was reported. Their scores were less uniform with each other. This male only base of reports is much more what you might call bounded. Men tended to say what other men had said. It was very common, very uniform. And the gender unaddressed, what you might just notice is that it's far along this left axis, so it has a lot in common with the men only. Again, we're seeing that pattern again. And it's closer to the men only than either of them are to the women only. And when you did an analysis of variance to look at how these broke down by gender and by region, you see that there is a significant effect of region in total knowledge scores, but interestingly, women and men seem to know the same amount. They receive the same kind of total knowledge scores when we account for all these factors. So no significant difference in, let's say, knowledge volume between men and women according to the analysis of variance. But knowledge diversity was kind of knock it out of the park. Women had much more diverse knowledge base and reported that knowledge in our protocol than did men. And again, you see a small significant effect of region, and I'm going to show you why it's not a significant effect according to our study. And that would be this. These were the significantly different pairs, meaning the ones in red are the pairs and the specific differences which were the most significant. So in this total knowledge score, you see that the Marmara and Aegean were significantly different, but we conducted men only and women only protocol in these two regions. Neither of them had a significant difference with the Black Sea where we conducted the gender unaddressed. So no real regional significance to the results, bottom line. What is much more significant is the significant difference between the unaddressed, gender unaddressed protocol and women. That was a very different research results, and men only and women only results are also significantly different. So how this breaks down more specifically according to that good stuff is really good to talk about. So for instance, again, you can kind of see these shapes between the men only breakdown, the gender unaddressed breakdown, the women only breakdown. Before you even look at what they are, you see these two resemble each other, while this remains unique, which just shows a certain effect of this specific protocol to engage women. But as it goes, both men and women were very knowledgeable about food, and these total reports aren't significantly different between what men said about food and what gender unaddressed groups said about food and what women said about food. You don't see a significant difference between the knowledge volume reported about food. But about gardening, you see that men only and gender unaddressed groups gave a lot more information. And that kind of looks like this. And building was also a significant category. What's interesting to look at is that kind of diversity, that evenness of information across the categories, from food, gardening, building, heat, medicinal, all the way to the cultural. Basically, women have a much more even-looking distribution. And when you look at the unique knowledge is where you really start to see that worthwhile component of women's knowledge. This, for instance, shows that, look at these values here of 22, 20 compared to 6 and 2. There were many, many more unique reports made by women, reports that were really valuable to understanding what's going on, as I'll go into, but ultimately wouldn't have been achieved and wouldn't have been discovered in a conventional approach or one that specifically only looked at what men knew. And so you see the categories looking fairly similar. So ultimately, kind of how to discuss and look at the breakdown and the differences in all this knowledge, I think I have 3 main ideas. So one would be, as Dolan says, do women know different things about politics? I would ask, do women know different things about chestnuts? And our study doesn't really show that that's true. There are some specifically important examples, poems, or let's say terminology for weather. There were a lot of examples where women would say, oh, we call a black storm a karakestana, and we ask men, so about cultural stuff, you say you know nothing. Typically, that's a typical response. But what about karakestana? Have you ever heard of a storm called karakestana? And they'd say, no. So women had a kind of unique way of utilizing chestnut terminology in day-to-day language, which men didn't seem familiar with, which is really important. And there's absolutely a kind of a segregation of knowledge about family and household business and economics. And there's not really much in our study. Another data set came out of our study by my colleague Taner Okan. But according to his estimations, it really was the case that men tended to know prices and annual income going back 4 or 5 years to a much more accurate sense than what you could ask from women. But women would often just basically say, that's something you should ask my husband. So that may be a lot about what women and men know differently. There's just kind of compartmentalization there in terms of household activities. But what did seem to be much more important is women knew things. They may have known the same things. They knew all about the horticultural traits, all about, let's say, really important agronomic practices. This knowledge was present in women's reports, but they knew about things differently. So the cultural reports and the unique reports were much higher in terms of women's responses. And so ultimately, women were happy to report about cultural issues related to the chestnut much more than men, who were much more resistant on that subject. Another kind of important way, I think, to understand this, how this data all fell out, is really something really important that I encountered from Miss Carol Colfer, our very own, in a very, let's say, a 1983 piece called On Communication Among Equals, which deals really specifically with gender, but also basically gets at what would today become described as more intersectionality, the general sense of social hierarchies working on people's identities, not just by gender, but by social category, income, religion, and so on and so forth. But generally, when unequals are communicating, how does it work? So for instance, in a mixed gender research team that approaches a woman at the side of the road, how is that going to work in terms of how she's going to try to serve up information in that research context? So what Carol would say is that someone who is, let's say, socially advantaged in terms of social hierarchy has a strong understanding that when they bounce a ball, it looks like this, and that's all they need to know. So for instance, men happen to know a lot about chestnut trees. In Turkey, they say so at the event of any interview, and basically they'll admit that what they do is know a lot, but women don't know a lot, they say. But women happen to know, if you're from a women's perspective and you're watching, let's say this person bouncing a ball is floating by on a large parade float, you would see the ball moving like this, and you would be aware that when you're bouncing a ball privately, it looks like this. And so ultimately, women tend to be aware of not just males' perspectives, but they have to maintain their own perspective as well. And ultimately, in an interview context where they're not comfortable, they may not express their version of reality as they understand it. And that really came through in terms of, I could go back and show certain things that didn't come out of the men only, out of the gender unaddressed. For instance, what would have been really important would have been husbandry, the really important labor of women working with animals. It came out in women only and gender unaddressed, so it must have been a very important topic, but didn't necessarily come out in the men only. So there were some subjects that women were willing to brave, let's say, discomfort in a social situation because it was necessary for them to get that important information out. But other categories were not so important, and you get this effect called muting, which is a lot of the knowledge that women expressed in their women-only protocol and the women-only environments was muted in those gender mix scenarios. And finally, I think my own take on this, and this is kind of what comes out of my paper, is the inseparability of working in Turkey and doing anything in Turkey, the inseparability of hospitality from that context. Hospitality is a very important theme in ethnographic research and working across cultures, but ultimately, hospitality really does underpin almost all of this work that we did. Individuals were very well aware that they may or may not benefit in any, let's say, material factor way right away, especially if they participated in our interview, but did so absolutely willingly. And ultimately, in terms of a very important lesson we learned in Turkey was that when we first brought up this idea of interviews with women to the male heads of household, they would often say something along the lines of, sure, it's absolutely, you can speak with women, but they won't know anything about chestnuts. And often, women would agree, and even at that very same, let's say, table or context. But what we translated that as over time, because we started off bristling up about that comment, but anthropologist Elif Aksoy encouraged me to be patient about it. The way to translate that in a charitable way would be, women don't know how to prep up and serve up information that outsiders are looking for. So men are much better at talking with outsiders because we know how to serve it up, and cook it up, and get you out of the village as soon as possible. But women experience, especially at this, what they would have considered in many cases a very kind of honorific experience of having women researchers from the city visit with them and a specific research team coming from the big city and their attention and attention's being paid on them and what they knew. There were deeper experiences of hospitality, I believe, for women researchers. And ultimately, that meant that they got beyond what they thought we researchers wanted to know, in many cases, and learned, oh, well, what we thought about you, let's say you were associated with the forest bureaucracy. We didn't want to tell you all the bad things we think about this new graft variety that you've been passing around. Men would never give us a lot of information. A lot of complaining didn't actually reach us in the men's only interview or in the gender unaddressed. But with women only, there was a lot of important details that came out in terms of women's preferences and their active preferences for the chestnut species going forward in the future in these government programs to kind of maintain population levels in the face of blight. So I think with that, I'll just move to questions, but I thank you for your attention thus far, and I really appreciate it. Thank you.